too far from the ground, they'll try to pull you down. Ignore the laws that call you earthbound. It's okay to not obey, to be afraid and in dismay, backing away from the array. You are a supernova soul. No need to fear when you're in control. Battling against the show your strength, you're the asteroid. You are the fire that burns through all of the doubts that hurt you, leaving worlds that you once knew. You are the supernova soul. No need to fear when you're in control. Lift yourself and use your voice. Show your strength, you're the asteroid.
All right, good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, May 5th, Cinco de Mayo. Hopefully everyone is having a great day. So we're kind of getting down to the wire a little bit, getting close to AP exam time. Hopefully you guys are ready. Remember, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. I am always available to help. After the AP exam, I am more than open to answering any questions, or we can have a discussion about what questions were on the AP exam. So we're going to, excuse me, today we're going to move into talking about food and agriculture. Obviously, this is pretty important. Eating is, or the ability to produce a massive quantity of food in order to feed everybody is what really drives the carrying capacity of our planet. The reason that we predict it to be between 12 and 20 million, or 12 and 20 billion, I'm sorry, is because of the ability to disseminate food to everybody. So going through our outline, we're going to talk about nutrition and food supplies. We're going to talk about major food sources, soil and soil types, the structure of it, erosion. We're going to talk about agricultural resources, so water, energy, and we're going to talk about genetic engineering and sustainable agriculture. So nutrition and food supplies. The world's food supplies have more than kept up with human population growth over the past 2 centuries. A big indication of where a society sits at as far as development, according to a lot of philosophers, is have they discovered the ability to use agriculture? That's one of the key milestones. There's like the discovery of fire and the wheel, and then agriculture is another really big one. 1950, there were 2.5 billion people. The average daily diet was less than 2,000 calories per person. In 2001, there's 6 billion people. World food supplies can provide more than 2,500 calories per person. We're obviously a little bit more than that right now, sitting a little over 7 billion. So with nutrition, the most common dietary problem in wealthy countries is overnutrition. We obviously talk a little bit about weight problem in the U.S., about how obesity and heart disease and things like that are an issue, and that a lot of that comes from overnutrition. In North America and Europe, the average daily caloric intake is 3,500 calories, which is quite a bit more than what's suggested. Sub-Saharan Africa has not kept food production up to pace of population growth. We talked about this a little bit when we discussed how populations grow and develop and all of that stuff. Collapse of the Soviet Union also led to significant collapse in food production. So looking at the percentage of overweight adults in the United States, 61%. Compare that to other countries: Russia 54%, UK 51%, Germany 50%, Colombia 41%, Brazil 36%, and China at 15%. So chronic hunger and food security. About 1 in 5 people in the developing world are considered chronically hungry. 200 million of those are children, and it can lead to permanently stunted growth, mental retardation, and other developmental disorders. Poverty is the greatest threat to food security, the ability to obtain sufficient food on a daily basis. Unfortunately, food is one of those things that you have to purchase. It's just not given out for free. And so whether you could get food or not relies a lot on how much money you have in order to purchase food. So essential nutrients. Malnourishment is nutritional imbalance caused by a lack of specific dietary components. Remember, it's not just eating food, it's eating the right foods. In poorer countries, people often cannot afford to purchase an adequate. Literally, this semi decides it needs to go by my house right now and be obnoxiously loud. In poorer countries, people often cannot afford to purchase an adequate variety of foods, including meats and vegetables. And so here's a map of where there's a high risk of nutritional inadequate nutrition. Notice there are some countries where there's not a whole lot of data, but you can see where it's at. It tends to be in a lot of developing countries where you tend to have inadequate nutrition. So protein deficient diseases. Okay. It's also known as a displaced child. This occurs mainly in children whose diet lacks high quality protein. It's kwashiorkor. Sounds good. Reddish orange hair and bloated stomachs. There is marasmus, which is to waste away, caused by a low diet in both protein and calories. Very thin and shriveled. We've kind of seen pictures of these. Iron deficiency is the most common dietary imbalance in the world. A lot of people in the U.S. kind of suffer quite a bit from iron deficiency. Leads to anemia. Remember, you need iron for your blood. It increases the risk of death from hemorrhage in childbirth and affects development. Red meats, eggs, legumes, green vegetables are all good sources of iron. You tend to see anemia quite a bit in people who are just starting out on vegetarian or vegan diets, because they don't understand that you have to supplement a lot of those nutrients from other sources. Famines. So famines are characterized by large-scale food shortages, massive starvation, social disruption, and economic chaos. This is something that was really interesting to me. I look quite a bit into this, especially with the Irish potato famine. We talk about it a lot in freshman bio. Mass migrations often occur because productive capacity has been sacrificed. Environmental conditions are immediate trigger, but political and economics are often underlying problems. So break this down. You have a lot of people who are stuck in these situations where they're perpetually hungry because of lack of food. Yes, there are environmental conditions. Irish potato famine, Dust Bowl, things like that are caused by environmental condition. But a lot of it is that there's politics and economics that kind of run behind it, and that can kind of amplify a lot of these issues. So arbitrary political boundaries block historic access to refuge areas. I don't want to be that guy, but it's just a line on a map, and that line on a map a lot of times can signify access to different areas. A really good video to see about that is looking at the division between India and Pakistan that blocks off some holy sites from people in India. So aid policies of rich companies often serve to distribute surplus commodities and produce a feeling of generosity. We take our excess food, we send it overseas. It makes us look a lot better, but also let's defeat them. Food camps have serious drawbacks, though, and it's just like with any camp that you have, any place where there's, low economic status, tight living conditions, stress and overcrowding, lack of sanitation, close contact to epidemic diseases. All those things pop up in poorer kind of tent communities. Major food sources. So 3 crops deliver majority of world's nutrients. And you could probably guess these being in Indiana. Wheat, corn, and rice. Potatoes, barley, oats, and rye are staples in cool, moist climates. So you tend to see a lot of these. So the Irish potato famine. Ireland's not exactly a tropical destination. Potatoes tend to be a pretty big crop for them. Cassava, sweet potatoes, and other roots and tubers are staples in warm, wet climates. Sweet potatoes tend to kind of be a staple of southern United States food. So meat and milk. So meat and milk distribution is highly inadequate. More developed countries make up 20% of the world population, but consume 80% of the meat and milk. All right, so developed countries, 20% of the world population, but we are consuming 80% of the meat and milk production. 60% of the production occurs in lesser developed countries. There was a big push, I want to say it was 2018 timeframe, but there was this big push of people who wanted the source of their meat labeled, because there was, I don't know why, but there was this big concern that if you were to purchase food, or if you were to purchase beef, it could be made of parts from cows that were in Australia or Europe or South America and all of these different places, and it was combined. So they wanted the food activists, I don't even remember the full story behind it. There's a thing called Google that you can look it up for yourself. But they had this big push of, they wanted meat labeled as to where it came from and if it came from multiple sources. So if you were to get meat that contained cow from Australia, United States, South America, Europe, it would combine all of that together into one package, and then they wanted that labeled that X percentage came from this place. So 90% of grain grown in the US is used to feed livestock. We know about this. We've seen the implications and the problems that it has. So every 16 kilograms of grain and soybean fed to a beef cattle in feedlots produces about 1 kilogram of edible beef. So thinking about this in the ecological food pyramid, if we ate the grain directly, we would obtain 21 times more calories and 8 times more protein than we get from eating the beef. So going back to that, why don't we? Why don't we just eat grain directly? Why do we have to eat beef? We all see the issues and the problems that kind of come about from it. A lot of the diseases passed around, and just the conditions that a lot of these cows are kept in. There's obviously some farms that are better than others, but many of them are not. Many of them are really bad, and the cows are in really bad conditions. So why don't we eat beef, or why don't we just eat grain directly and forego, the middleman? Well, a lot of it just comes down to palatability. Like, my favorite food is hamburger. And I know that that's not a popular thing. I know that there was someone in a previous life of mine that I told that to, and they were quite upset with it. Like, how could you sit there and do that to a poor animal? It's like a lot of it is just because it tastes good. Like we enjoy the taste and things like that. And I'm sure that you could prepare grain in a really good way, but a lot of times the reason I'm not a huge fan of veggie burgers is because veggie burgers just don't taste good. Like black bean burgers are really dry, and a lot of times they just don't taste good. Now, the Impossible Whopper is actually really good. It's tough to kind of tell the difference between an Impossible Whopper and a regular Whopper. I know you can, but it's very tough. And that's just it. It's like now that it's starting to become better and that option is available, then usually if I go to Burger King, I take advantage of that because of the environmental implications behind it. So the next part is seafood. Seafood is an important protein source, especially to a lot of people that live in kind of coastal areas. Like fishing is a major source of not only the economy, but of food. Since 1987, 13 of 17 major fisheries have declined or become commercially inviable. Between 1970 and 1990, number and average vessel size of world fishing fleets have doubled. There's a really good picture of this of people that go on fishing trips, and you would get back ashore and they would take your picture of you holding up your big catches in front of a sign in order to promote the business. And the companies have kept a lot of those pictures, and they've shown a decrease in fish size over that time frame. These fishing fleets now have twice the capacity needed to extract total annual sustainable harvest. Sustainable harvest meaning that if I go out and I catch a bell curve worth of fish, that I can go back next year and catch that same bell curve. Catching 70 billion costs 124 billion. So this is a lot of times, if you're not doing it on a large commercial scale, it's very difficult for you to regain some of your money back. And a fourth of animals are considered to be bycatch, as in they're not, you're not going to sell those for someone to eat. So soil, there's an argument that it is a renewable resource, and I agree with that. It's a complex mixture of weathered materials, partially decomposed organic materials, and a host of living organisms. At least 20,000 different soil types in the U.S. This is arguable, but there's a lot of different soil types, and a lot of it is based off of, yes, what the soil is made of, but also the components that are kind of in that matrix. They vary due to influence of parent material, time, topographic scales, climate scales, and the organisms that are there. It can be replenished and renewed. Soil compositions. Particle size affects soil characteristics. Spaces between sand particles give sandy soil good drainage and allows for aeration. But they can easily dry out. Tight packing of small particles and siltier clay soils make them less permeable to air and water. And we'll go through a graph later on. So soil structure. Soil exhibits a wide range of organic contents. Humus is insoluble residue from partially decomposed plant and animals. Most significant factor in soil structure. Activity of organisms living in the soil helps create structure, fertility, and cultivation stability. So soil profiles. This is kind of something that I'm really interested in with soils. So soils are stratified in horizontal layers called soil horizons. Together they make up the soil profile. So if you see a core, that is a soil profile with each of those layers being the horizons. So the O horizon is the organic layer. This is leaf litter, partially decomposed organisms. Then you have the A horizon, which is your topsoil material that partially mixed with organic material. Then you have your E horizon, which is your leached layer. This is where a lot of depleted soil nutrients, they end up there, and then those get drawn out pretty quickly. You have your B horizon, which is your subsoil, often dense texture from accumulated nutrients. The C horizon is your parent material. This is weathered rock fragments with little organic materials. And this is what it looks like when you look at a picture of it. So you have your O horizon, or your organic layer that's on top, surface litter, leaves, things like that. And then your topsoil, or your A horizon. Your E And then notice E is where roots kind of start to end at or terminate. Your B horizon, C, and then down to your bedrock. So this is a soil profile with all of the horizons in it. So soils are classified according to the structure and composition, 12 orders. So there's moss soils, andiosols, alpha soils, vertisols, spodosols, histosols, oxisols, inceptisols, ultisols, entisols, and artisols, and gelisols. I struggle bust with that hard. Ways we use and abuse soil. So approximately 11% of the Earth's land area is current in agriculture production. Just look at a map, you'll see it. Up to 4 times as much could potentially be converted to agricultural land, meaning that we could have up to half of the world as agricultural land. Much of this additional land suffers from constraints. So looking at soil degradation, you can see areas that have been completely stripped out. In Indiana, we do have some concern with our soils being stripped out. It's not as bad once you start to move west, because a lot of this is just pure agricultural land. Not only that, but a lot of times some farmers can be really slow to adopt new equipment because it cuts into their bottom line. Stable terrain, and then you have non-vegetated areas like Greenland, which is not green. Land resources. So in developing countries, 95% of recent agricultural growth has been from altered agricultural practices. So this is the use of pesticides, use of fertilizers. There's other things that are in there, herbicides that are added in order to control weed management. So less land cultivation in the U.S. Now than 100 years ago. Now, there's a big boom 100 years ago. Farming was a really viable career. A lot of people did it, and it was a family business. You had 10 kids, and those 10 kids worked on the farm unless there wasn't enough room, and then they started their own. And so you end up with this kind of perpetual cycle. But that's kind of teetered off a little bit, and the reason being is because we have better agricultural practices now that definitely help. Many developing countries are reaching limit of lands that can be exploited for agriculture without unacceptable social and environmental costs. Look at the Amazon rainforest. So you have that unacceptable social and environmental cost that's happening with that. Land degradation, estimated nearly 3 million hectares of cropland ruined annually via erosion, 3 million hectares transformed into desert, and 8 million hectares converted to non-agricultural use. If you want to see a really good example of this, look up a video about the Amazon wildfires on Vox. That's VOX Vox, not FOX Fox. Like this, it's a news YouTube channel, not a hysterical channel on TV. Definition of degradation are based on both biological productivity and expectations of what the land should be like. Right. So when you look at an agricultural land, there is a level of productivity to that, but then there's also the component that plays into that of, what should that land have originally been, or what should it be right now? Generally, land is considered degraded when soil is impoverished and eroded, runoff is contaminated, and biodiversity is diminished. We do see this. It isn't as common as it used to be, but we do still see this in places. Water and wind are driving forces for a majority of soil degradation. Erosion. So erosion, even though we talk about, there's soil erosion, we make it seem like it's a bad thing. But erosion is an important natural process resulting in redistribution of products of geological weathering and is part of both soil formation and soil loss. It tends to begin subtly, and then worldwide erosion reduces crop production by around 1% of world cropland per year. It doesn't seem like much, 1%, but you have to think of how many farms are actually out there. Mechanisms of erosion. So there's rill erosion, small rivulets of running water gather together and cut small channels into the soil. I have this in my front yard. There's a little path that's formed every single time it rains, and it just kind of wears a lot of that away. There's gully erosion. Rills are enlarged to form bigger channels, are too large to be removed by normal tillage. Stream bank erosion, washing away of soil to establish stream banks. You tend to see this quite a bit in like northern Indiana. And then wind can equally or exceed water as an erosive force, especially in dry climates and on flat land. This was an issue that I used to see a lot in South Dakota. Every single time it would, the winds would pick up really bad and it was really windy there, it would get really dusty. And that was just the wind removing a thin layer of that soil and blowing it everywhere. All that dust is not made out of just like hopes and dreams. It's made out of top layer. Intensive farming practices, so row crops leave a lot of soil exposed. There's not a whole lot underneath those crops. And then you have weed-free fields. It's actually really common in Montana. I want to say that fields go fallow where they don't grow stuff on it for a year, and that leads to this exposed soil. Removal of windbreaks. It's really common in the UK that people have trees along the edge of their farm fields in order to provide a windbreak. Not so common here. No crop rotation or resting periods, as in switching from corn, which contributes nothing to the soil, to soybeans, which are nitrogen fixing through the root nodules, bacteria in the root nodules. And then continued monocultures, growing one type of crop, which does lead to higher yields. There's been some experiments to do it. Part of my PhD research was looking at over yielding, which is where you plant a monoculture in order to get a higher amount than you would get if you had a diverse group. Other agricultural resources, water. You have to add water to plants, and agriculture accounts for the largest single share of global water use. We use water more on crops than anything else. As much as 80% of water withdrawn for irrigation never reaches intended destinations. It's a cheap cost, encourages overuse. And water is not super expensive. If you take you take an hour-long shower versus, well, I don't know who would take an hour-long shower, but you take an hour-long shower versus a half-hour-long shower, yes, that's the double the water use, but the amount that costs in the long run is not all that great. It leads to waterlogging, where you have kind of this layer of water that just never goes anywhere. And then it can lead to salinization or increased salt concentration in soil. Fertilizers. So lack of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus often limits plant growth. This is why there was an experiment that was done in Wisconsin or Minnesota, one of those places, where they were looking at production or primary production in a lake. And they had one side where they added nitrogen and another side where they added nitrogen and I want to say it was phosphorus. And what they found is the side that you added nitrogen and phosphorus was completely covered 100% in algae. And it showed that phosphorus tends to be the limiting or potassium and phosphorus tend to be those limiting factors, because you can do crop rotation and things like that. So this is why when you purchase fertilizer, you have NPK fertilizer. NPK meaning that it has nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium in it. Adding nutrients via fertilizer usually stimulates growth and increases crop yields, which is the whole point of agriculture. You want to have bigger plants because that makes you more money. In 1950s, an average of 20 kilograms per hectare of fertilizer was used. Compare that in 1990, where an average of 91 kilograms per hectare of fertilizer was used. Manure and nitrogen fixing bacteria are alternative methods of replenishing soil nutrients. Right now, the most common source of fertilizer is human waste. At water treatment plants, they take human waste and they dry it out because sending water is expensive. So you dry it out and then you sell that as fertilizer, and that's what ends up on fields. Energy. Farming is in industrialized countries is highly energy intensive. It takes a lot of energy to do that, to plant everything, to harvest everything, to ship everything. All of those steps require quite a bit of energy. Between 1920 and 1980, energy use rose directly with mechanization of agriculture and indirectly with spraying chemicals. Altogether, U.S. food system consumes 16% of total energy use. Most foods require more energy to produce, and then to process it, and then to transport it than we yield from them. Because remember, it's not just growing it; you also have to be able to send it to where it goes, and there's many other steps involved in that. Most of world food comes from 16 widely grown crops. At least 3,000 species of plants have been used for food at some point in time. Many new and unconventional varieties may be valuable to food supplies. So winged beans, for example, triscale. And this kind of leads into the Green Revolution. Most major improvements in farm production have come from technological advances and modifications of a few well-known species. So corn yields had jumped from 25 bushels per acre to 130 per acre in the last century. This is a big point of contention. I remember when I was at University of South Dakota, there was a big argument about this where if you plant GMOs, you get a higher yield out of it. And because of that, it tends to be more environmentally friendly to plant GMOs. But there was a big argument against that because you're talking about planting, or the companies that make GMOs tend not to be the most consumer friendly companies. Most of grain accomplished through conventional plant breeding. We've seen the rising of a couple dwarf varieties, and the Green Revolution, the definition is spread of new varieties around the world in agriculture. Genetic engineering, or GMOs, genetically modified organisms. These contain DNA possessing genes borrowed from unrelated species. So a common one is BT corn. They can produce crops with pesticide resistance and wider tolerance levels. Opponents fear traits could spread to wild varieties, increasing expenses and widely hurt small farmers. This is a big thing that Monsanto went through when they released their corn. What they did was they released their corn, and farmers could use a small section of that to make seed corn. And then other farmers were like, well, we don't want their pollen of their genetically modified crops to end up on our wild corn plants or our natural corn plants. And so what Monsanto did was they decided to make their crops heterozygous, so that if the traits spread, there was a chance that recessive traits would spread and not cause any effects to other corn. But because of that, farmers could not use those crops as seed crops anymore, because 1/4 of all of the plants would be homozygous recessive, therefore not display the traits or the reason that you're buying genetically modified organisms, meaning that farmers would have to go back to Monsanto every year. And then the farmers started to complain, well, now Monsanto is hurting farmers because they're not allowed to grow seed crop. So what is it? Do you want them to be allowed to grow seed crop in order to make more corn, or do you not want them to do it so that you can protect your plants? So it's kind of this lose-lose situation, and it just kind of shows this negativity toward Monsanto. And I'm not like supporting Monsanto in any way. I think they have some pretty dodgy business practices, but there was a YouTube channel called Company Man, and he did a video about why do people hate Monsanto, or why they're hated so much. And it's a really good video if you look into it. They just tend to be like at the wrong place at the wrong time and kind of do the wrong things. So 70% of all processed foods in North America contain transgenic products. Basically, they contain genes that are not specific to that organism. Friend of mine, two friends of mine, used to make GMO soybeans when they were getting their masters. Sustainable agriculture. So a lot of this revolves, oh my God, the fattest squirrel in the entire world is in my window right now. Like it is, this thing is huge. Sitting here talking about overeating and the US being overweight, and then I have this fat squirrel outside my window. So soil conservation is a big one. So managing the topography of your soil, or of the soil, in order to allow it to drain really well, but also allow water to make its way into the soil so that plants can get it. So this is contour plowing, which is plowing across slopes to slow flow of water. If you drive around Indiana, Ohio, you'll really see this. It's like farm fields that have kind of a landscape to them. Like you look at it, it looks more of like a dirt bike course than it does a excuse me, than it does a agricultural field. Strip farming, planting different crops and alternating strips along those land contours. Terracing is shaping land to create level shelves of earth to hold water and soil. This tends to be more common the further west you go. Okay. All right, provide so also soil can provide ground cover, or you can provide ground cover for it. So annual row crops cause highest rates of erosion because they leave soil bare. So looking at this picture, you can see where you have soybeans that are planted and just this bare section right in between it, and erosion pops up from that. And you don't want to plant something on there that's going to leach too many nutrients from the soil, because then that'll decrease your yield of soybeans. It also needs to be something that you plant in there that you can get something out of. A lot of times farmers will plant things that they can use as feedstock. So you leave crop residue after harvest. And my dog is hearing absolutely nothing and deciding to bark. So plant cover crops after the harvest. So after you remove these, plant something else in its place. Hans, chill out. Okay. He's upset about soil conservation. So reduce tillage, minimal till by using a chisel plow, conserve till by using a Coulter disc disc plow. There's also no-till, which uses drilling. This is a lot slower and it's more expensive. Often farmers using conservation tillage must depend relatively heavily on pesticides, because you're offering more of a habitat to these pests, and those pests can end up on your crops. This is why in the UK a lot of times they use hedgerows in order to have a place where those pests can go to and not end up onto the crops. Traditional tillage help control weeds and pests. So let's summarize all of this stuff. This went a lot faster than I thought. This was one of the longer presentations. The one on Friday is going to be really short. So we talked about nutrition and food supplies, talked about major food sources, we talked about soil, the structure and erosion, talked about agricultural resources, a big one being water, and energy that goes into it. Remember, we use quite a bit of energy for agriculture. Genetic engineering of plants, and then sustainable agriculture. And then this is a picture. This is a palm plantation. These kind of came under fire around the hashtag Team Trees timeline, because a lot of peanut butter uses palm oil as a replacement for 100% peanut oil. And what that does is a lot of times these trees are removed from the landscapes, and this provides habitat to a lot of primates, a lot of times orangutans. And so this was kind of the big push behind Team Trees, was to raise awareness for orangutans being in these palm plantations. Obviously, being something on the internet, everyone had a 10-minute cycle, and then once Mr. Beast came out with his next video, everybody forgot that he was trying to plant trees and kind of moved on from it. But there is kind of this big thing, and a lot of people, when they look at purchasing peanut butter, one of the things that they look at is, does it contain palm oil? I'm one of the people that does that. Yes, it is for environmental reasons. Like, it sucks when orangutans, lose their habitat because it causes changes in their populations. It can also cause fragmentation. But there's also a, like I said about, like, why do we eat beef rather than sticking with just eating grain, and a lot of it comes to palatability. And if you have pure peanut oil or peanut butter that comes from peanuts rather than palm oil and peanuts, it tends to have a better taste, and it also doesn't tend to be as runny. Like, it tends to be kind of a thicker peanut butter. And then we feed it to our dog, and then being that we have a dog. They're a lot more susceptible to chemicals being in foods because of the fact that they weigh a lot less. So that's why when you like dogs with chocolate, we can eat chocolate even though is it toxic to us? Yes, it's just we weigh a lot more than dogs do, so it takes a lot more for us to build up toxic levels. And it's xanthol, which is this chemical that's added into peanut butter in order to increase the flavor. But that is all I have for today. The AP exam is coming up, so if you are interested in taking that, remember to be online. Go to AP Central and kind of look into stuff like that, and get up to speed on the AP exam. If you need any help or you have any questions about it, send me an email. But that's all I have for today. I will be moving over to Google Meets shortly. I'm going to use the bathroom, and then I'll move over to Google Meets so you guys can ask questions. But thank you for watching.